Hello, and welcome to the Reach or Miss Show, the podcast for the customer-focused entrepreneur, where Hayut Yogev speaks with entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs about reaching or missing the critical point of approaching the right customer with the right message at the right time and place. The point where business success starts. And here is your host, Hayut Yogev.
Reach or Miss, Episode 19. Douglas Burdett is the founder and principal of Artillery, a business-to-business marketing agency in Norfolk, Virginia, and is the host of the Marketing Book podcast, which was named by LinkedIn as one of the 10 podcasts that will make you a better marketer. Prior to starting his own firm, Douglas worked in New York City on Madison Avenue for 10 years at ad industry giants J. Walter Thompson and Grey Advertising. Before starting his business career, Douglas served as a U.S. Army artillery officer in Germany for 3 years and then earned an MBA. Douglas Burdett, what a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Hyatt. Thanks for the opportunity. I hope this will be helpful for your listeners.
I'm sure it will. And I just shared with our listeners your bio and what you've done until now. I would like to ask you to share with us what are you doing today and what's passionate about and where are you heading?
Well, I have a marketing agency, small marketing agency. It used to be advertising oriented, and now it's very much content and internet marketing. And I'm also the host of the Marketing Book podcast, where each week I publish an interview with the author of a sales or a marketing book. And I've done that for about 2.5 years, and I really like it. And that's what I have been doing, and I'm very interested in. And hope that I can share some maybe some helpful books, book ideas, and lessons along the way that I've learned that might be helpful for the entrepreneurs and the startup folks who are listening.
I'm sure you will, and I wanted just to ask you where you're heading.
Well, I would like to get more clients. We're always looking at that. We're doing a lot of content and speaking, finding more ideal clients rather than just any clients, and growing the business with really, really good people.
I want to ask you, I love your podcast. It's very, very interesting. I thought it's almost genius to have this connection between marketing and marketing books. How do you see that? How did you come with the idea to have a podcast about books as a marketer?
I have been listening to podcasts for many years. I mean, maybe since the mid-2000s, back when you would plug the iPod into the computer to upload episodes. And I always enjoyed listening to marketing podcasts. And I particularly enjoyed interviews with authors of books. I was also very interested in marketing books. When I would go to conferences, if I knew an author would be there, even though I would have already read their book on a Kindle, many times I would buy the actual book just so they could autograph it, which sounds a little bit crazy, but some people collect signed sports memorabilia, and I collect signed sales and marketing books. And it seemed like podcasting was becoming more and more popular, and it still is. And I thought that I could do that. It seems like it's less competitive than a blog, although I have some blogs for my business. So I jumped in, and one day I looked on GoDaddy and saw that marketingbookpodcast.com was available. So I took that as a sign from on high.
It is a sign.
I did that in about 2 months. I was able to put the show together and launch it. And I had met a number of the early guests on my show at conferences. I'm not sure they all remembered me, but like at book signings, what I did is I made 11 videos of me talking to the camera, pitching these authors on the idea of being some of the first guests. And to this point, 10 of them have been on the show. And the 11th one, I'm waiting for him to write another book. So.
Okay, that's interesting. It was like 2.5 years ago, all 10 videos?
Yes, I did all 11 videos just in one day. They were short videos of me talking to the camera, making a personalized pitch to these various authors. And so I did them all at once and sent them out and got a quick response. The authors were, very, very generous and very helpful, even though I was just getting started. And some of them have come back as they've written other books.
I think it's a brilliant marketing idea to market your podcast that way, and obviously worked. And I wanted to ask you who your customers are. I don't know whether you're going to talk about your company, your podcast, or both.
Well, the customers are usually small to medium-sized businesses who sell to other businesses. They need to have a sales team that can work the leads that we would help to generate. And they're generally selling something that's expensive and involves a number of stakeholders who are involved in the decision and maybe a slightly longer sales cycle. So it's the complex business-to-business sale that we are looking to help companies with. And particularly what's helpful is if we create content for them, for their sales force to use and for them to publish online to get found and generate leads. That's ideal. So in terms of the audience, 60% in the United States, 40% overseas. It's a lot of marketers, business owners, and quite a few people in the sales world as well. I'm not using the podcast so much to generate business, although it helps. But the first benefit of the podcast to me is that it is professional development as performance art. And I say that because I read the book before each interview. So I'm up to about 135 interviews at this point. So it forces me to read these books, and it's sort of like getting a master's degree in modern sales and marketing. And I absolutely love doing it. And hopefully that enthusiasm and interest comes through for the listeners.
Who are the customers for the podcast? Do you see any similarity between those two?
Yes, sometimes. But there are the people that listen to the podcast it's a pretty broad audience, actually. So it's not as targeted as, let's say I wanted to get more manufacturers. Well, theoretically, I would do a podcast about marketing and sales just for manufacturers, and I would only have manufacturers on the podcast. That would be a more ideal way to do it. And I guess I could still do that, but instead, the Marketing Book Podcast is just it's a broader net, you might say. So I'm talking to people in all different industries and all different countries and that type of thing. So there are a smaller group of people that I want, that my business wants to help. The audience for the podcast is much larger. So it's not a perfect overlay. In fact, there are a lot of entrepreneurs and startup people who listen to the show, and I don't really work with them. I should send them to you, perhaps. Yes.
First of all, you should, and we'll talk about it after the show. However, it makes sense, and it makes me happy that still seeking for answers in the books, because somehow it seems like marketing is vanishing from the world of entrepreneurial and entrepreneurship and businesses. Joe Polizzi actually having a book called Killing Marketing.
Yes, I just interviewed him last week. I was very excited. Yes.
How was that?
Oh, terrific book. He is only one of 2 or 3 authors who are members of the Marketing Book Podcast 3-Timers Club. And that means that he's been on the show 3 times. And the book was absolutely fantastic, as all are his 4 other books. But it was very, very different. And I can't wait to see what the reaction to his book is going to be. But I really, really liked it.
I think it's very interesting, and I think calling a book...
And I saw that you interviewed him. I think I saw that, right?
Yes, I did. I interviewed him. Yeah. It was a wonderful interview, and he is really a very unique person.
He's a wonderful guy.
Give us the best advice you can to our listeners about how should they approach the customers. What should they take into consideration there?
Absolutely. And, of course, I can answer this, but I always have to sprinkle in lots of book recommendations. So
you should.
Hopefully your listeners would appreciate this. One of the best things that a startup can do is to understand who their real buyer is. And I say real buyer because a lot of companies are started or are marketed, and they might even be targeting the wrong person. And there's a terrific book called Buyer Personas by Adele Rivella. It's just one of my favorite books. And, in marketing these days, despite what the marketing gurus will tell you, there is no secret sauce for marketing. But I think that understanding your buyer persona is pretty much the closest thing to it. It's really the linchpin. And basically, the buyer persona is an archetype, a fictional representative of who your ideal buyer is. And if you read Adele's book, or even go to her website, buyerpersona.com, she's got an ebook you can download, and it talks about the 5 rings of insight that you want to understand about your buyers. And those things of insight that you want to find out about your buyer's life really don't have anything to do with your product. And your salespeople are going to have trouble trying to tell you that as well, because much of this happens before they finally come to your company in search of a problem. So the more that you understand the world of your buyer and your buyer persona, what they really want emotionally, what their concerns are about a company like yours, even if it's a misplaced concern, it's enormously valuable. Everything else from your company, your marketing, your product, all can fall out of who your buyer persona is. Now, there's another book that I recommend by Aaron Ross, and he co-authored Predictable Revenue, and then he wrote a follow-up book called From Impossible to Inevitable, which he said was even better. And in the book, he talks about these 7 things that every business needs for hypergrowth. And he helped take Salesforce from 0 to its first 100 million, and he had never been a salesperson. And one of the things he talks about in the book is nailing a niche. Don't try and be all things to all people. And in that part of the book, he talks about the importance of talking to 20 people. He says it's amazing how many startups and entrepreneurs don't just go talk to 20 people. And when he says 20 people, it means not your friends, not your family, but somebody who could be objective and wouldn't mind telling you if your idea is a little bit lacking or maybe a good idea. And he said you're guaranteed to be you'll benefit, but just by talking to 20 people about your product idea and get them to poke holes in it. And then finally, there was another book that I had on the podcast by Tom Hogan and Carol Broadbent. It was called The Ultimate Startup Guide. And they are a marketing firm in Silicon Valley, and they only work with companies that have received venture capital funding. So really the cream of the crop. And that book would be an excellent read for your listeners. And in the book, they talk about some of the same things about the number one reason why startups fail is because they're creating a product for which there isn't really that much of a demand. In other words, the entrepreneur or the engineer, they think they have a very interesting solution to a problem, but it might not be a problem that really needs to be solved, which doesn't mean they shouldn't start their company, but they should be open to listening to what the customers say, back to buyer personas, in order to refine their idea. And in the book, they take you all the way through finance and everything. And it's really 85% of the book is great for any business. But in the book, it was very funny. They start and end with the fact that the icon of Steve Jobs is probably the worst thing to ever happen to startup CEOs, because despite Steve Jobs' success, most of what he did isn't normally successful. And a lot of CEOs think that they have to behave and do everything Apple does, which is unfortunately it doesn't usually end well.
I love what you're talking about so much. And you know that CB Insight has a great survey of startup failures. The number one reason that entrepreneurs that do startup fail say as a reason for their failure is there wasn't a market need. 42%. I want to ask you about the biggest failure with customers.
Well, not so much with customers because I test everything out on myself first. But I'll give you an example. Years ago, maybe 5 years ago, something like that. So I started my company in 2001, and I had worked at advertising agencies in New York City, big ones, and one in Virginia. And then I started my own company, and it was very much focused on advertising. Television, radio, print, all that sort of thing. That was sort of my background. And along the way, I saw that whole model was changing. Perhaps like a travel agent 20 years ago might have realized that their whole world was changing. I don't even know a travel agent now. I'm sure there's some out there. But what I did was I realized that I was too young to retire. So I hired this consultant. He had been blogging on his own website about ad agency new business. And I had been reading his blog because it was full of helpful, interesting information. And his blog was targeted to ad agency owners and new business development people. So what he did with agencies is he's done this, he's still doing this. His name is Michael Gass, and he would get an agency to determine what niche that they wanted to focus on and build a blog separate from their agency website. So it's sort of like throwing a fishing line off the boat. So in other words, you get the idea. So they would just reach that specific niche. So he said, what do you think you might want to build this blog on? And I said, I'm not sure, because I've worked on everything from Listerine mouthwash and Panasonic all the way down to the local bank and hospital. And I said, but I'm fascinated by the military. I was in the U.S. Army, and there's a lot of defense industry in Virginia, even more than in California.
Oh.
And I have a lot of friends that work for these defense firms, and they're always asking me marketing questions, and it seems like nobody's really talking to them. And marketing has never been as important to the defense industry as it is to, let's say, other industries like casinos and hospitals and car dealerships and software companies. So he said, well, look, if you're the least bit interested in that area, why don't you build a blog about that? And then even if you don't get any business, you'll have taught yourself everything you need to know about digital marketing, content marketing. And that's what agencies are going to be helping. All these ad agencies are going to be helping their clients with in the future. And I said, okay. So I started this blog, and it was all about marketing for defense industry people. There was a lot of traffic to it. I got a lot of attention in the press. But just to circle back to my original point, there wasn't a lot of demand for it. In other words, most of these defense firms, they still want to sell to the government, and they want someone to tell them how to get another government contract, which is not what I was doing. I was writing articles about how they could be diversifying into the private sector, and even how they could be using content marketing to get the attention of government buyers. And it's just a very, very different business model. And I jokingly say that sometimes I think most of them come into the office Monday and wait for an RFP to come over the fax machine from the government telling them what to do. And there are a lot of listeners from Israel, a lot of people I've met through LinkedIn and Twitter who are in the defense industry in Israel. But it wasn't really, it was a solution in search of a problem.
Okay. It's exactly what you talked about before.
So I would consider that kind of a failure, although I learned quite a bit about how to build an audience, which I think is, as you know from Joe Polizzi's book, that's one of the most important things marketers and companies should be doing, is building their own audience.
That's correct. It probably should be the right audience as well. Because
exactly.
The audience that don't use your product at the end of the day don't really help.
Right.
I want to ask you about success. If it's possible to hear about what you consider as your greatest, most significant success as a result of the right customer focus.
Just to go back to the podcast, I think I would look at that as a success, because I'm getting a lot out of it. I'm getting to meet a lot of really smart people. It's very exciting to be able to read a book and then talk to the author. It's generated, business and traffic and all that type of thing, and speaking opportunities. And I feel like I'm helping people, because I think a lot of the listeners to the Marketing Book Podcast, or at least a certain number that I hear from, are people that are maybe new to marketing, or they might be executives somewhere who have been thrust into a marketing role, and they're trying to understand what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to think about these things. And there are a lot of marketers. There's generations of marketers who are having to learn a lot of new things that they didn't necessarily learn in school and hadn't been doing up until maybe they changed the job or something like that. So I would look at that as a success, and it's something that I thought about, I planned for it, I put together a launch. I've really enjoyed it, and I think the audience has too, which may be why it continues to grow.
I do believe it is a great success. I must tell you that even in Israel, that there are some very famous podcasts that we can't find in Israel. People are not aware of, but your podcast is well known in Israel.
Oh, I'll have to come visit.
So, yeah.
I'd love to.
You should come visit, and you should open your iTunes with Israel, and you can see that you ranked quite well there. So I think it is a success. And I think we are in your favorite part because this is the part about recommendations. I wanted to ask you, is there any tool, but I won't take it against you if you'll talk about the book again. What is your recommendation for the best or most effective technological or digital tool that's related to customer focus, marketing, or sales today?
Wow. I don't know that there's necessarily a tool that comes to mind. I think it's more of a mindset for a company. I think there's a lot of companies out there that are thinking that technological tools can solve process or people problems. So I think the most important tools are the ones where you're able to listen to your customers. But you've got to do more than listen. You've got to take action. So I'm going to get a few points off for that one probably.
No, you didn't. I think it's a beautiful thing to say. We hear a lot about that actually marketing has become something of numbers, the numbers guys, and not something that really look into the customer. So you won't be surprised that this is the biggest advice that people are giving. Talk with your customers. And there isn't a tool for that. You don't need a tool for that, actually. You just need to listen.
It's true. And there have been some books on the podcast about, it's almost amazing. These books like by Martin Lindstrom, he wrote Small Data. It was a fantastic book. And in the book, he talks about how marketers are now using data sort of like a drunk uses a streetlight. It's more for support than for illumination. And you've got to go just sit down and talk to people. And we do that for clients where we'll start with a new client and we'll do a workshop and then we'll go interview their customers. And when we come back with what our insights are, which are usually not consistent with what the client is telling us, they look at us as if we've spoken to the burning bush. Mm-hmm. Where did we get these insights? How do we get so much knowledge?
And
all we did was talk to the customer. Exactly.
I want to ask you, was there any person, but you can also talk about a book that impact your success? It can be really any book or any author or any persona that really had a major impact of your business way. Who really influenced you the most?
I would say there's two books that have probably had the biggest influence. One was I got out of the Army in the 1980s and I went back to school to study business for a couple of years and to sort of decompress from having been in the Army for 3 years. And I was looking at a lot of different careers, and a friend of mine in New York had suggested I look into advertising, and I didn't know much about it, so I went to a professor who'd worked in advertising, and I said, what's one book I could read to find out if I'm interested or not? That's how I would do it. I would read a book about a field and then maybe go talk to some people that were in it to see if it was of interest, because I knew that if I could find something that was sort of interesting, I would be more successful at it. And this professor gave me a copy of Ogilvy on advertising.
Sure.
And the book was pretty new at the time, and I read it and I put the book down and I said, that's it. I found it. That is what I want to go do. So I was very, very, very excited about working in advertising, and I went on some interviews in New York and Chicago at agencies, and they said that having come from the military, it was very unusual to go into advertising. So I put an ad together. It was a picture of me in front of one of my howitzers when I was in the Army, and it said, ready, aim, hire. And it had funny copy and a resume on the back. And this was before the internet or the World Wide Web and email and all that sort of thing. So I got lots and lots of interviews, and I got a job at J. Walter Thompson, which is the oldest ad agency in the United States, one of the biggest in the world.
And the second one?
Yeah, so that launched me into the ad world, and I was very excited. I still have a copy of it, and I loved it. And then, as I said, I saw that the whole world was changing.
Definitely.
And I realized that this ad game was kind of changing, and it just wasn't the same, and I was going to have to figure out what I was going to do next. And so I read David Meerman Scott's The New Rules of Marketing and PR, and that helped me understand the new world. It was almost as if it were 500 years ago, and Copernicus was sitting there with me explaining that the Earth rotates around the sun instead of the sun around the Earth. And I suddenly understood it all. And as a result, David Meerman Scott, he was the very first guest on the Marketing Book podcast, and he's come back twice. And I'm planning to interview him in 2 weeks about the 10th anniversary edition of that book, which is in its 6th edition.
It's funny because just 2 weeks ago, Jeff Burdett talked exactly about this book and how meaningful it was for him. So I think it left an impact on a lot of people.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'd love to have him on the show. Maybe you could help. I could ask you in the future to help with an introduction because I've been a big fan of his for years.
Yeah, I talked with him. He's from Australia. He's a very nice guy. It was a very interesting interview, and some very interesting things happened to him. And this book was one of the major impact on him.
Oh, wow. I'll drop your name when I contact him.
First of all, you're more than welcome. And second, you can hear the interview with him as well. Before we say goodbye, I just want to ask you, what is your last piece of guidance to our listeners and how they can best connect with you?
Well, I think the advice would be to listen to the Marketing Book Podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
Great advice. I'm sorry I didn't think of it before.
The advice that I have is based on something that I saw Mark Schaefer write a few weeks ago, and he's the author of several best-selling books, and he's a member of the Marketing Book Podcast Three Timers Club. And he wrote this post about how there are no longer any marketing experts, only students. So I think that a lot of people that are out there, like entrepreneurs or startup people or existing people who have marketing jobs, and they're very, very frustrated that they feel like they're drinking from a fire hose and they can't quite understand it all. You're not alone. There's a lot to learn, and it's really a process of continuing education. Just like a medical professional, they have to constantly be learning. Marketing is now like that.
I do agree. I think it's so interesting that you're talking about that because in a way, it's like medicine. Now everything is changing. Mm-hmm. Marketing have been changing every half an hour in terms of social networks, in terms of everything. So
It's changed since we started this conversation.
Yeah, actually. So we should run and learn what have been changed during the last half an hour. And what is the best way to connect with you?
Well, on Twitter, my Twitter handle is Marketing Book, and on LinkedIn, my name is Douglas Burdett, and the website for the podcast is marketingbookpodcast.com.
And we will have all this in our show notes, and thank you so much, Douglas. It has been a pleasure. It has been very interesting, and I'm really thanking you for coming here.
My pleasure, and I hope your listeners found some helpful nuggets.
I'm sure they will, and I'm sure a lot of them will come to listen to the Marketing Books podcast, so you'll see them there.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. And for you, our listeners, until the next time, it all goes down to this. You either reach or miss. Keep reaching your goals and vision. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Reach or Miss Show, the podcast for the customer-focused entrepreneur. You can find all the information, links, and resources that was mentioned at the show in our website, reachormiss.com. See you next week.